Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Councillor Promise Knight. I'm lead member for Housing, Homelessness and Renters Security in Brent. And we've got a wonderful panel with us this afternoon to have this conversation about build. So I'll just set the context. So we know what the challenges are. Most of us who work in local government understand policy implementation and also the challenges that people face, the real challenges that people face on the ground. So in Brent, for instance, our TA pressures are astronomical. We've had a 122% increase in homelessness application when compared from last year to this year. We have about 150 homelessness presentations a week. There are large numbers of our households in overcrowded accommodation. And the story of overcrowding is something that is very familiar to me. I know what it means to grow up in a two-bedroom shared with 6 relatives and to share a bed with my sister. So this issue is very much real. And we also have the compounded effect of, in London, for instance, we've seen 120% increase in landlords exiting the temporary accommodation market. And quite frankly, in Brent, we've had to slow down in a number of our developments just because of affordability. The viability gap is just too vast. And with some developments, we've had to pause, and obviously that has significant impact on our ability to deliver for people who need it most. So I will let the panelists introduce themselves, and also it will be helpful to set the context and also highlight to us what you want to see and what you feel needs to be done to address this issue, because quite frankly, we are in a housing crisis. So I'll hand over to Freddie first.
Hi, I'm Freddie. I'm the director of PricedOut, which is the UK's campaign for affordable house prices. We've been, as an organisation, not me personally, but we've been talking about the housing crisis since about 2008, and it's only gotten worse. We focus a lot on young first-time buyers trying to get on the housing ladder, and the evidence shows that a 21-year-old saving 10% of their take-home pay every single year would not be able to buy the average UK priced home until they're 34. And if you're talking about in London, especially, or any other major city, that's much, much worse. It can be well over 40 before people are able to get on the housing ladder. But this isn't a London-only crisis. We see this is worst in major cities, but every area has their own version of a housing crisis. It's different, and they all have different sort of local presentations, but the root of all of them is undersupply. We haven't built enough homes in this country for at least 50 years, and the next government, probably the next Labour government, is going to face an absolutely generational challenge in fixing that. So it's really good to hear the headline ambitions coming from Matthew and his team, but I'm really excited to hear some of the policies and the detailed work that Labour are doing to make sure that, on day one, we're going to see real change on planning and getting houses built, because I think that's really the only game in town.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Freddie. Matthew, over to you.
Great, thank you everyone for coming to this fringe, particularly given Rachel's in the hall. I would have thought it was a much bigger draw, but you're obviously very interested, and with good reason, in the issue of SMEs and housebuilding in particular. And one of the reasons I wanted to come, I'm more than happy, I'm sure we will get into the housing crisis that exists across this country. And it is, I always say, it's an entrenched crisis, but it's an intensifying crisis. And in lots of parts of the country, it is getting to a critical point, certainly is in my own borough on temporary accommodation, on a number of other metrics. Why I wanted to do this event in particular is that I think if you look at the housing model that has become prevalent in our country over recent decades, it is hugely disadvantageous to SME house builders. And actually the truth is, we will not be able to, as a government, if we have the fortune of being elected to office, of addressing the scale of the housing challenge that we will face without SME house builders. We cannot do it with the volume builders alone. So we need SME house builders to play a very critical role. My worry at the moment is that the system is almost uniquely set up to make things difficult for SME house builders to not only to thrive, to in many cases survive. And so we have a dynamics of a system, and this is due to a lot of reasons: a slow and uncertain planning system, high land prices, persistently volatile housing market, that mean, in normal times, SME house builders find it hard to compete with the volume house builders and their speculative business model. In hard times, and as we are seeing, many just simply go bust. And with every housing downturn, you get a sort of further ratchet, a further homogenisation of the system, to the extent that we've seen, over many, many decades, the volume of SME house builders reduce. And that's concerning. We've got to turn that around. We think, and we've said we've put some various ideas out there in the past, we think there are a number of very targeted policy interventions that could be undertaken to help SME house builders in the here and now. And I'm thinking about things, how Homes England use grant funding, for example, what the NPPF does in terms of identifying sites for SME house builders. Perhaps we can get into some of those specifics. But I think more widely, we will never, in a sense, have a housing system that really works for SME house builders unless we grapple with the fundamental reasons why we've seen a structural decline in them over the past 20, 30 years. And I'd say, and you will hopefully see, if those of you following this, in the next 24, 48 hours, some more detail coming out, adding to what we've already said, in terms of an ambitious housing, planning and land market reform agenda that we're rolling out, that I think will do a lot to address some of these structural problems. For example, just in general terms, having government accept greater responsibility for development outcomes, and taking, particularly on large sites, a stewardship approach to development, making that more the norm, not the exception. There are great exceptions out there in terms of some of the sites coming forward, but they are very rare as things stand. We need more of those. And it means more of, for example, the use of a master developer model to de-risk large sites, to give SMEs some of those opportunities. So I think that's my sort of headline point. There are a number of targeted interventions. We would encourage the government to make them. We think they can be done pretty quickly. If the government wants to do them over the next 12 months, we're more than willing to help them. But I think there's a more fundamental question we perhaps get into, which is the nature of the housing system we have and how we can unpick and unwind some very fundamental trends that have been happening over recent decades. But if we don't do it, I come back to my central point, we will not be able to address the supply issue, build the amount of homes we need. And we're very clear that we have to do that. I think you're absolutely right about the historic mismatch between supply and demand. It's not the only problem. I think we've got a problem about quality, we've got a problem about good placemaking, so it's not units at any cost, but we want to drive those numbers up, and SME house builders are going to be central to achieving that mission.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Matthew. Paul, I'll hand over to you. You come to this from a developer's perspective, so it's interesting to get your thoughts.
Yeah, my name's Paul Brocklehurst. I'm chairman of the Land Planning and Development Federation, having been last in the speakers, I've probably got very little to add to what's gone before me. It's really refreshing to come to these events because we've probably spent as an industry 3 years in the political wilderness, and now housing has been placed at the top of the agenda. And for us, I think that is refreshing. We've spent a very, very frustrating period being held back from delivery, because that is what we're all in business to do. So I'll just pick up on one or two additional points. I mean, I completely agree in terms of the context that's been raised. I mean, if we look at a variety of reports, we're somewhere between 2.5 and 4 million houses short of where we should be as a nation. And if we put that into the social impacts and moral impacts, I think it's quite shocking. We've seen a decline in social housing delivery over the last 12 years. We've gone from 40,000 per annum to 7,000 per annum. Actually, when you take account of right to buy, effectively the social housing stock in this country has declined. So in every type and tenure of housing, we need more of it. When we look at the structure of the housing industry, I'm not really going to repeat what Matthew has said. I mean, our report here, the small builders, big burdens, highlights where we've got to. In the last 4 decades, we've gone from 40% of our homes being delivered by small and medium-sized house builders to a position where only 10% of them are. And that structural change has occurred partially, maybe in large part, to changes in the planning system. And the planning system has become expensive to navigate and interact with. It's taken far too long now to get planning decisions. Now, part of that, I would have to say, is the complete underinvestment in planning resource at local authorities. We need massive investment in local authority resourcing. That is an important part of the equation, but not the only part. And as a consequence as well, the risk for a small builder or a medium-sized builder has increased exponentially. So you're risking your financial capital in a very, very uncertain environment as to what the decision is going to be. And in far too many instances, allocated sites or sites with a positive neighbourhood plan review are being refused and then end up having to go to an appeal, which is a further cost to the underlying house builder. So I think it's a really difficult point in the market. Just a few other points. I think and Matthew's alluded to it, this document, the National Planning Policy Framework, has only really one paragraph on small builders, and it's very targeted, and it just talks about sites of less than 1 hectare or 10 units. It does not talk about the sites that a medium-sized house builder would require, which are probably under 100 units, if you're going to try and grow your business to start competing with the volume house builders and break that cycle that we're talking about. So we need this document to be amended to include a medium site policy. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a decline in planning consents of sites of less than 100 dwellings by 37%. So fundamentally, we need more sites, and part of that is both at the decision-making level, but also at the local plan-making level, where we basically now have no local plans, or are ending up getting into a position where, unfortunately, in early 2025, when Labour are likely to form the government, there will be no local plans on which to base housing delivery. And so from that point of view, as an industry, I think we're all calling for a sort of 100-day plan, which I think was alluded to in a variety of the speeches recently.
I think 100 days is banned, actually.
Oh, right. Well, I hope maybe it is 100 days. And actually, again, I really applaud some of Matthew's opening comments, because it sort of addresses the need to create a more permissive environment to try and tackle some of these huge issues we have in the supply side at this moment in time. And I'm conscious that we should have a debate, so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul. You pretty much preempted my next question, which is around specifics. So we agree, all of us agree in this room and perhaps across this conference, that house building needs to be turbocharged. We need to turbocharge delivery, and we need it now. So for instance, in Brent, we are exploring a number of options, which include modular constructions, MMC, modern methods of constructions, to increase house building. Now, the appetite within the sector to innovate and to find innovative solutions is palatable. So now my question is, what specifically, as it relates to SMEs, house builders, do you want to see now? Freddie?
So I think that the overall picture, as has been pointing out, has been completely slanted away from SME house builders, but there was never a decision taken that we need to kill the SME house building market. And I think that there are specific tweaks. I think, Homes England, for example, does not, or has not in the past, dealt very well with small builders. We don't do enough master planning with small sites sold off with outline permission. But the overall point is that the system has gummed up over time. Everything has accumulated all this craft. each maybe with a potentially a positive meaning behind it once, but it means that only if you're a PLC house builder with a huge balance sheet to take that risk can you really get on with it. So I'll leave the policy details to the guys with policy teams, but I think the key is that the government's getting out of the way. It's not necessarily that you need to spend a huge amount of government money to fix this. It's about getting out of the way of SME builders and large builders alike, but don't have that tilted playing field where only once you can pay to play, once you can do a 7-year application, and that's fine to sit on the balance sheet. You get out of the way, speed up those timelines, don't subsidise things, fix the regulatory system. That's where the issue is, I think.
Thank you so much, Freddie. So, Matthew, you're the guy with the policy team. And so we look to you for sort of...
I don't know who they are. Robin's there from my office. But
we look to you for specific sort of potential policy solutions and perhaps commitments.
No, absolutely. I'm going to be slightly guarded because there's stuff to come in what remains of our annual conference. But I'd say two things. One is the availability of sites is absolutely key to SME house builders. So I think, and I take the point about medium-sized plots, which I think is a good one. But I think in the very first instance, what could you do tomorrow? The government's consulting on the NPPF. You could ensure that there is a much firmer expectation on local authorities to bring forward their under 1 hectare 10% requirement, so that every local authority in the country had that there. And I think that would provide a much firmer basis for SME house builders to invest in and build on those sites. Then I think there are things, we've mentioned Homes England before, but I mean the way that Homes England in a sense distributes or judges its bids is actually quite difficult for SME house builders. So particularly if some of them had to go through the continuous market engagement route, for example, you could do much more of an emphasis on quality over cost and other tweaks that in a sense could make the playing field for SME house builders a bit easier. So I think there's some policy ideas that there's some good practice going around the country. For example, I think London's got a great small builders program, which is about matching landowners with SME developers. So there's lots of these very small policy tweaks. I suppose I'll come back to my sort of first point. I think that might arrest the decline of SME house builders. I think you've got to do much more fundamental changes to the system. And if we're looking at, for example, if we're looking at doing nationally significant developments, large scale plots, stewardship, master assembler, that's where you can, I think, really get into giving SMEs a big bite of that cherry, if you like, and bringing them forward. It helps on other areas as well. MMC, for example, we absolutely need certainty around the pipeline on SME to really scale it up. So there's elements, I suppose, I'd say, in terms of how the wider housing system works. But there are a number of very small tweaks that I think, if you're looking at intensifying development on brownfield land, bringing more brownfield land, that you could make sure SMEs, get a good go at that.
Thank you, Matthew. Paul?
Matthew's absolutely right. I mean, in terms of me waving NPPF here, actually, the problem with the NPPF is half the time it's not what's in it, it's the fact that nobody implements it properly. And so there is a small sites policy, but a variety of studies have shown that people are not delivering a small sites allocations through their local plan process. They just tend to lump them in with windfall sites, which then therefore means that those small builders are taking the speculative planning risk on trying to navigate through the planning system. The reason why I mention medium-sized sites, though, is I think what we have to remember is we also have an affordable housing crisis, and small sites do not deliver affordable housing. So sites are sub 10 units don't deliver affordable housing. And that's why I think there is an extremely important gap in the policy framework for medium-sized sites. So I think it is important to fill that. I think one of the other interesting things is we have a tendency as a country our response to issues is to regulate. rather than think about the underlying structure of the industry that you're in. And one of the things I would say is, if you go back, sorry, I'm old enough to remember the 1980s, so, and actually there were some good times there. The music wasn't bad anyway. But one of the things was that when we had a fully functioning SME sector, we didn't feel the need as much to talk about design and quality, because actually the SMEs distinguish themselves from their volume house builders on the basis of design and quality and innovation. And actually that was also good from a competitive marketplace point of view, because it created pressure on the volume house builders to ensure that they innovated as well. For me, it is a relatively fundamental issue within our system, and this is not sort of volume house builder knocking. I'm not blaming them for the fact that the system has effectively given them a competitive advantage, in that it costs so much. They're the ones with the cash flows that can cope with it and sustain the issues that are within the planning system. But actually, the SMEs can be the catalyst for that positive improvement in design and quality and innovation. And so that's why I think they should be. Just getting on the point of modular construction, fundamentally we've gone through a period over the last few years, or in fact less than that, the last 12 months, where many of our modular construction companies have gone bust. And they've gone bust because they have not had sufficient demand for their product, and this demand comes from a lack of supply of planning consents where they're used. So these people have invested huge sums in factories to get their modular product up and running, and they've not had the flow of requirement demand to get their cost overhead back and so on and so forth. So there is a huge issue. If we're going to commit to MMC, which we all believe we should, then we actually have to do it at a time when we've decided that delivering planning consents, delivering housing of all types is extremely important.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just on the question of the topic of affordability and regulation, so we know that there are essentially some barriers that SME house builders may face, which you've rightly highlighted, but there is also a question of contextual relevance and affordability of those properties, of those who live within particular localities and neighbourhoods, and if we're talking about placemaking. So, for instance, we know that in Brent, paying more than 65% of market rent is not ideal. It's not affordable for our residents. And if we are really serious about sustainable growth within this context, contextuality is absolutely important. So I just wanted to bring Freddie in terms of your thoughts on affordability versus delivery for SMEs.
So I think that the route to truly fixing the affordability crisis in the long run is always going to be supply. There are short-term reasons why we do need to do things like affordable housing delivery and especially social housing delivery. But I think that the point that Phil was making about market structure is really important, because market structure drives a lot of the issues that we see with delivery and thus affordability. So land banking, for example, or slow build-out rates are often downstream of how our planning system has structured it to focus on these large sites that, just as a commercial level, will never have an absorption rate of 100 homes a year. There aren't 100 families wanting to live in that exact spot. So having a more heterogeneous market gives more options to consumers, and it also gives more options to government for partners. For example, if you're bringing forward sites in Brent, for example, I live just across the road in Westminster opposite some fantastic Brent regen that's really transformed the area. Finding the right partner for there and making sure that even if you're going with big builders, there are smaller builders who are able to keep them honest, keep them really competitive. That's absolutely crucial. So I think that there's all of this affordability, delivery, this is downstream of this market structure question that's so crucial in the UK, specifically on making sure that houses are affordable now and delivering those affordable houses. It can be difficult, and that's why those really small sites are particularly difficult, because you don't have the cross-subsidy, the market rate subsidising some of that discounted rate. And that's why this tilted playing field is so damaging, where SMEs there isn't a continuum. You've got the small sites policy, and you've got the system that's set up entirely for big sites. And in this middle gap, where especially in cities, a lot of the sites people want to bring forward are these medium sites, might be 50 homes at higher density. It's really crucial to fix that, so that you're not got one developer who could possibly do it, and you're completely beholden to whatever Barrett's willing to, not picking a random name out of the hat, willing to build in that spot, because it's clearly not working for UK consumers, it's not working for renters, it's not working for anyone.
Thank you, Freddie. Matthew?
On general affordability. I mean, this is where I sort of might slightly differ with Freddie, and I find generally, I've said this, I'll say it again just quite clearly, I find this YIMBY-NIMBY debate completely reductive, and I think it obscures a lot of what's going on. But there's no doubt in my mind that, and there's a really good piece of GLA research recently, if you build lots more houses, you will bring down prices, but over the medium term. We're talking 10, 15 years out, and in a way that will make a difference for lots of buyers, but it's not a silver bullet, and it's not a quick fix, but we've got to do it. We've got to boost supply. It's part of the answer. But I think you must tackle the affordability problem now, here, and as it stands, and that is just about boosting the total number of affordable that you get through planning gain, as part of what Angela announced yesterday. So if we're going to boost supply, we want to make sure as much of that supply is affordable and of the right tenure, I should add, to meet assessed local need in particular areas. But to do that, we've got to make sure that local authorities can properly negotiate with developers on viability, and that developers can't wiggle out the commitments they make. So we've got to get the right viability level and then ensure that it's delivered on. And that's what some of Angela's reforms take. But then I think we've got to look what we do differently with government grant funding. So with the government capital expenditure that's already allocated, the performance of the Affordable Homes Programme could be much better. We could sweat that grant more effectively. It is absurd that the government is, however it wants to badge it, it is giving back, it is reprofiling money that should have been spent this year because it can't get it out the door. And with the housing crisis as it is, with the downturn that we're currently in, I think there can be no excuse for that. So we've got to get the existing money out the door, sweat it better, give more flexibilities about it, and then I'd argue, and I'll come on to a fringe I did this morning, I find it, we've got to direct the bulk of that grant funding towards social rented homes. It's not just in my part of the country, but the core need. We've got a shortage of affordable homes. We've got a chronic shortage of genuinely affordable social rented homes. We need to strengthen local plans so that local areas are clear about what is their housing need, what they need to deliver. And then we've got to put measures in place, and the government, the most immediate way it can do that is by repurposing the Affordable Homes Programme, switching the grant spend that the government have already committed and directing it to social. And I think that will make the biggest difference. And I think SME house builders can be part of that. Small sites and other things are part of the mix. But too many, I think, of the incentives in the system, in a sense, work perversely. I've got a couple of conservative boroughs not far from me in London who deliberately encourage developers to come in with extremely small sites so they can avoid affordable housing contributions. Yeah. So there are all these elements of the system which work in an odd way. And then lastly, I'd say on planning capacity, because I haven't addressed it, and if Robin's nodded to me, Rachel said it now, so I can say it. But we want to take steps to, in a sense, give local planning authorities a shot in the arm in terms of capacity very early on. Government have done bits, there's a little bit of funding for its super squad, we've got to go further. Even 1 or 2 planning officers in every authority around the country would make a difference, because I think part of the reason SME house builders are often the afterthought is, if you're a local housing planning officer in a local authority, how do you meet your housing targets? Where do you get your bang for your buck? You're going to go to process the big site applications as the way to meet your numbers, and they haven't got the capacity often to process the applications on a smaller site, so that's where everything gets bogged down, it's too slow. So we've got to reduce capacity. So Rachel's just outlined a sum of money. I'm told it's now been said, so I can say it, but she's outlined a sum of money that will give that shot in the arm. And then we just got to plan for that workforce more effectively. And we just don't plan for the planning workforce. I find it ironic, but there's no one saying we need this many planners. We've got to give the profession status. We've got to bring people in that have gone to the private sector. Because at the moment, if we do all of the other reforms we're talking about and we don't resolve local authority capacity, the whole thing will remain gummed up.
Absolutely.
Actually, just to confirm, I don't think I would disagree with a word Matthew's just said. I think that I know that the union movement can be sometimes a bit loud on Twitter and places like that, but in the end, especially if you want to deliver social and affordable homes in key job centres, areas where there's real housing, the crisis reached a real fever pitch. That's building more homes. I think sometimes I describe it like a three-legged stool, that we're never going to have just sort of one type of housing delivery. This mix is super important, and I think you can. What we'd love to see, and I think Labour are really moving on well on this, is policies that can deliver social homes because they're also delivering private homes and using that the planning gain, the cross subsidy, however you want to phrase it, to deliver that community benefit. Better social housing, more affordable housing, and community amenities that sort of maybe don't exist sometimes where Section 106 are wriggled out of. We're completely on board with all of that.
I think we're slightly different. I'm going to just chip in, give you a bit of interest back and forth, but I think I am very clear that we can't meet the level of affordable housing need through the planning system alone. The market is not going to deliver the amount of affordable housing you need, and this is where grant funding and other government interventions come in, because particularly on social, given the build costs and the rest of it, you've got to have alongside. So I think you're right, we can get a lot out of the planning system, we've got to make that work better, but the market will not cater in total to the level of affordable and social housing need, and that's where government has to come in. It has in part, but I don't think their affordable homes programme is working as well as it could.
I absolutely agree. As the only local authority representative on this panel, I of course welcome some more grant funding. I welcome any intervention that loosens the joints in terms of the planning process. So all of that is very much appreciated. Paul, welcome your thoughts on affordability and some of the constraints.
I think fundamentally when we talk about social housing, the reason why I alluded to it is, again, I'm old enough that when I was doing planning applications, negotiating Section 106, and was being told, well, there'll be 40% affordable housing here and 70% of it is rented, my immediate assumption was it was social rent. That was where we were 15 years ago. And effectively, as a result of a change in the registered providers funding model by George Osborne in 2012, that completely changed overnight and we moved to affordable rent. And because of undersupply, partially, but largely I think, we've had a situation where rents have increased such that the percentage of market rent is still a big rent that somebody is being asked to pay in an affordable rented house or product. And so personally, and our members I think are very aware of it, and indeed probably have been sort of disappointed by the drift. Actually, we're ready to deliver social rented stock. Now that isn't to say affordable rent doesn't now have its place. It's a form of intermediate affordable housing. But I think we're all waiting now for social rent to form the major part of our Section 106 negotiations. Now, I think I set that in the context. I'm not here as a regeneration specialist. And I think a lot of SME house builders probably find urban regeneration sites more difficult because of the increased risks within them, because they have remediation issues, they have build cost issues. It's the area with a higher build cost. So a lot of the time they are talking about more greenfield development sites. And those are the sites that actually you can get on and you should be able to deliver social rented stock out of. But the problem is that doesn't do you any good in Brent. And that is where government, I think, does need to play a far more active role in targeting where the grant money goes, because the planning system is more able, and I would have to say as well that the planning system is going to find it hard in delivering affordable housing in certain parts of the countries from greenfield sites, because not all land is created equal in terms of the value across the country. And that's probably, again, a factor of sort of undersupply, greater undersupply in some areas than others. But so for that reason, I think government needs to be far more targeted where it uses its capital resources to deliver that social housing product.
Thank you, Paul. I think what's absolutely clear within this discussion is that there is appetite within the sector to build and to innovate, but there are a range of barriers that the sector finds itself in. So Matthew, I just want to bring you back in terms of Paul's comments in terms of rents and build costs, and actually does purely increasing grants go far enough given the context that we now find ourselves in?
I think there's two parts to that question. So if we sort of separate out what is the temporary, so we know that current market conditions are having a huge impact on development pipelines, and everyone is struggling with that. But there were lots of problems that existed before this temporary situation was in place. And I suppose that's where my mind is more focused on resolving some of the problems. So I do think you're right. I mean, we can't, and it wouldn't be sensible to just keep chucking endless amounts of grants if that's the kind of proposition you're putting to me. I think we've got to, grant funding, as for the reasons I've given in response to the previous answer, will remain an absolutely central part of how you deliver affordable, in particular genuine affordable housing. I think we've got to, in the long term, and we're looking at this, we've made some announcements, we'll make some more in what's left of the conference, look for ways of how we might reduce that subsidy gap. And I think there are lots of ways. So, for example, greater rent policy certainty for social providers can bring down borrowing costs. Enhanced CPO process can help local authorities on specific sites, either in terms of streamlining the process, but in terms of hope value on specific sites to drive up affordable. So there's a range of measures I think you can use to bring down that subsidy gap, rather than just saying the only way to do it is to increase the spending envelope. But the government's committed £11.5 billion to the Affordable Home Programme. That's just not an insubstantial amount of money. And I think part of the problem is how are we in a situation where they can't get that out of the door. And the same goes for brownfield funding. I mean, the brownfield funding pots are incredibly complicated, loads of pots, bidding in. I think some of this is just about being a bit smarter with how the system works and how government supports people through these different funding packages.
But I've always been amazed, sorry for stepping in, I've always been amazed, and I don't fully understand government accounting. I think that's probably one of the issues, and maybe Matthew, you'll end up in the situation of trying to have the negotiation with HMT about this. But we spend £50 billion a year on housing benefits. Mm-hmm. Why as a country are we not trying to channel capital investment? Because housing should be considered as part of our infrastructure as a country. Everybody deserves a home. It leads to better educational outcomes, it leads to better health outcomes, it provides our sort of employers with satisfied and sort of well looked after staff. And so from that point of view, it seems to me that somehow we should be channeling some of that money so that ultimately we're spending less on housing benefit and actually we've just got more housing stock. I don't know how it works.
I think that, but it's an interest, and it's a debate that's been around for a long time, this sort of benefit to bricks argument. I remember writing stuff about it in a different life before I was there. But I think the problem is, two things. One, the strain that housing benefit is putting on the UK economy is phenomenal, and the thing that really worries me is if you actually look at the sort of trends in terms of where this is going, housing benefit is almost rising at an exponential rate. You know, we were at 23 billion, we're now at, I think, 30 billion, we're projected to 34 billion. And if we don't address it, absolutely, things are going to get very bad, not least because I think there is a generation now coming through that hasn't had access to home ownership, and we're in a sense piling that problem on as we go forward in the decades ahead onto housing benefit exclusively. The problem has always been, and there is no easy fix to this, that making the switch over is incredibly expensive. You need to build a lot of affordable homes at the same time as you're sustaining the housing benefit, and only in the very long term will it switch. So I always say to people, it's not a sort of instant switch argument where you can make savings very early on. And I think that's part of where you get into the Treasury mindset we all understand quite well. You know, over particular spending cycles, particular parliaments, how you begin to kind of try and make the switch in a way that, in terms of government accounts, starts to make sense. But I think there's broad agreement on the fact that, you know, where we are is unsustainable, becoming more so, and you've got to do it. But I come back to, part of, and here I'm going to make the party political point. You know, we're not here completely by accident. You know, George Osborne took the decision to slash the affordable homes budget in 2010. Supply has torpedoed. And I come back to, it's interesting. Gove has slightly changed the rhetoric around social housing. The policy delivery hasn't matched. They've made a couple of tweaks, but it hasn't matched. But they've changed the rhetoric. But Gove's predecessors, you know, I remember as a local councillor dealing with some of this, the rhetoric around social housing was state subsidised housing, full of like all the, you know, the most desperate and vulnerable people in society, and we actively want to suppress that tenure. So we are not here by accident in many ways when it comes to why so much of housing need is being met through the housing benefit system, to the cost of all of us. You know, and we do have to address that fundamental point. But that is, as with so much of this, I think that is a painful, laborious process over many years of turning the whole thing around.
Paul, I can see you're desperate to come back in.
Well, no, I agree, and I sort of understand, and I've been told that some of it comes down to the sort of cost-benefit analysis that HMT tend to run on these kind of long-term models, and it just feels as if at some point somebody will say it is part of our long-term infrastructure, and therefore we will need to do something about it. I suppose now I've mentioned the word infrastructure, and I think sort of I've got Matthew here, and it'd be interesting on Matthew's views on infrastructure, because I know one of the frustrations that all builders have, but it particularly again impacts small and medium-sized house builders, is the interaction with the infrastructure providers, so statutory service, electricity companies, water companies, gas, but that's an out-of-date technology really. And also, you know, perhaps also highways. But the actual time period, I was speaking to a medium-sized house builder on Friday, having a cup of coffee, and they've got a small site, well, relatively small site in a village in Warwickshire. It's not in the, you know, it's a sensible location. And they were given a timescale by the electricity provider to provide electricity in 2027. And that has now been delayed to 2030. So one of my pleas is, I think, I know you don't like the 100 days, but
it will do stuff within
it'll end up being too much in the 100-day pot. I suspect that's where the fear is. But I mean, you know, we need a task force of some kind within DLUC, and I mean, it doesn't need to be huge, but to coordinate and start addressing some of these infrastructure issues. I think in West London last year there was a moratorium on housing development because basically all the electricity capacity had been used. Data centres had taken it all, and as a consequence there was no electricity for new homes. So I think this coordination of infrastructure, and you know, when people talk about unimplemented planning consents, that is one of the reasons why we, as an industry, there are unimplemented planning consents, is the timescales to actually get infrastructure into sites, just basic services.
But I think this goes. Do you mind me to? But I think this goes to the heart of some of the debates around housing, because, and this is when it comes again back to the sort of YIMBY-NIMBY debate. There will always be a core of people who want no development in their areas. But I have found, and in my experience at a constituency level and talking to other colleagues around the country, there's a much larger group basically who are happy with development if it is good, high quality development, if the places that are being created are good places, healthy places, sustainable places for people to live. And I think that part of the challenge we've got is, as well as just boosting numbers, is just getting better outcomes in terms of places and amenities, so that your offer to people is not that it's all downside, but that there is a lot of upside. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that requirements on infrastructure providers, how those agreements are negotiated. I think it's easier on some of these large sites. If you've got a big large site with a master developer, land being assembled, the weight of a body like Homes England or a development corporation to negotiate with the providers is much harder. But we've got to do more to get that upfront infrastructure. At the moment, it's way too reliant. I've got this in my own constituency with GP practices on negotiations between different bodies. I think we've got to get to a position where we're saying to communities, the GP surgery, the school, is not a nice to have that might come in year 6 of the build out. It's up front and you can see the community be created around it. And then I think we won't get rid of all of the resistance, but I think there are ways to dampen some of the instinctive resistance around. Because if you look around the country, there's way too much of just low quality, identikit, not public transport connected development happening, and people rightly don't like it. And I think we've got to change some of the models and how this is happening so that the offer is better when we're saying more, but better as well.
I completely agree, and I hope you'll join us. We've invited you to our manifesto, PricedOut's manifesto launch, which is all about how we get local communities on board with exactly that. How do you turn what sometimes called NIMBYs, but generally just people who really care about their local environment. How do you get them on board with development, and how do you make good places? Though it's not always just developers at fault. We've seen, I know one development up in Cambridge, which is built by the university there, and that's a really conscientious master developer who was in phase 1 put in space for a GP practice and can't get anything from the local clinical commissioning group because there's no money in the long term to start that GP practice. So it's incredibly complex, and you've got 15 different consultees and groups with different pots of money, and I think that it's going to be really crucial to work through that and prove to local communities that when there's a promise of a GP surgery, both from the council and from the developer, that's really going to happen.
Absolutely, thank you all so much. I'm conscious of time, and one of the things that I think that's really important to highlight that it's collaboration is important, and this must be predicated on mutual understanding between policymakers and house builders. So I will sum up, but I just want to invite the panelists to give us last words, just in terms of what do you want this particular audience to leave with in terms of SMEs, the challenges to affordability, and also the need to build. So I will start off with you, Freddie. Just very quickly, last words. What do you want this audience to leave with? I mean,
hopefully housing has been so high up on the priorities. Leave with an understanding that the absolute crucial thing I think is building, and maybe Matthew and I slightly disagree here. I think the hitting numbers of units, especially in our, in and around our big cities where there's huge demand and well in excess of supply, is absolutely key. And one of the ways to do that is build better places. But maybe leave with some optimism that Matthew and his team are on the right track, and obviously we'll be there making sure you stick with it in government. But we're much more optimistic about the hopefully incoming Labour government than we are about the current Conservative government.
Thank you, Freddie. Matthew, no pressure. 100 days, all the things that is required within those 100 days. So what would you like us to leave with?
I'm not saying 100 days again. No, but I think, when it comes to doing what we need to do, I think there's a lot we've got to do very early on to get us out of what will be an abysmal mess, and we'll be bumping along the bottom in terms of house building rates, in terms of up-to-date local plan coverage, and all the rest. So we've got to do some things, some bold measures very early on. But I see this is a 10, 20 year project to turn around a system that is failing. It is a system, very complex system that is failing in a number of ways. But my top line would be to everyone here, particularly SME builders are here, is we know that we can't do this. We cannot build the homes to buy and rent that people all across the country need with the major house builders alone. We need SME house builders. We're very conscious of the need to provide you with more support, and as I say, to address some of the fundamental issues that make it difficult for you to thrive. So hold us to that. Hope to continue the dialogue with all of you about how we can achieve those objectives.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Paul, last lines?
Well, I think Matthew summed up brilliantly, because from my perspective, I don't think you can achieve any meaningful aspiration on housing delivery through the existing structure of the housing industry. It needs to come with a growth in the SME builder sector. And I think the upside, bearing in mind every 100,000 additional homes leads to 300,000 jobs, the benefits of housing to wider society, I think the upside to a Labour government from seeing that delivery and to the country are enormous. So for me, I think it's fantastic that housing is now at the top of the agenda, that there's a positive discussion taking place on delivery. And I think I'm not being misquoted, but I think Cllr basically said 1.5 million in the first term. That will, bearing in mind where we're going to be in the state of play of the planning system and the housing market, that will be a challenge in and of itself, even if there are people that think we should be delivering more than 300,000 homes a year. Actually, that will be a really stiff stretch target in the first term, but I know that the sector, the private sector, is there and keen to play its part in that delivery.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you also to you, Freddie, and also to you, Paul. I think as a lead member for a local authority with unprecedented challenges regarding housing and housing need, I think that the fact that housing is well and truly on the agenda is of great interest to me. So thank you all for your time this afternoon, and we do hope that you enjoy the rest of the Fringe events.
Thank you.